we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever want to reach out to the podcast, hit us up on our DMs, the Bigmark podcast or the Bigmark pod on our Instagram or Twitter. If you are watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to the channel and follow along and share with your friends and do all that stuff wherever you're watching and listening. Thank you again for being here. Check out our Patreon, patreon.com/BigmarkPod. We're going to jump right into it today. It's funny, today's going to be the first, like, part 2, if you will, of another episode. I mean, I know I did 2 parts of bread making, but this is going to be an episode that I've done long ago. So go check out, the last time I covered Harry Potter, but that was a little bit more about the movies. Cause again, as I'll talk about in a little bit, I knew a little bit more about the movies up until recently, but inspired by a few friends and loved ones, I was kind of inspired to get into the actual books. I did try when I was, of age, if you will, of wizarding age. I started when I was 11, which is the same age as like Harry Potter when he gets his letter to go to Hogwarts, and I loved the first book. I thought it was amazing. But I just couldn't get in the second one, but we'll get into that one. We'll get into that in a second. But again, it's kind of one of those things, such a big cultural phenomenon. It was a shame that I never got into it. And I really enjoyed the movies, but I also did want to see kind of what the big fuss was about. I've kind of listened to, or if you will, read or listened to, because I listen to a lot of audiobooks, everyone, as I covered on one of my last episodes. But like listen to, if you listen to my podcast about it, the studies show there's not really a big difference with retention. So I'm going to just say read. So get off my case. But no, so I wanted to read like a bunch of kind of like literary classics, kind of just get back in. Like, obviously this was such a cultural phenomenon. I don't even have enough time to go into the cultural phenomena that is Harry Potter. Today I'm going to be kind of, again, talking more about the books themselves and a little bit how they kind of relate to the movies, because that's kind of what I know. But again, there's just so much time. I could, again, probably do a part 3 on like Harry Potter and just in pop culture and how big of an effect it's had, and then J.K. Rowling's life outside that, and you can go on and on. So like I said, if you do want to go back and check out the episode, again, we cover about a little bit more about the movies and kind of the magic, if you will, so to speak. But again, like I said, when I was a kid, I got into Harry Potter and I was like, all right, like this makes sense. I'm going to read this book. I love Philosopher's Stone, Sorcerer's Stone, whatever you want to call it. It's the British version versus the American version. I can't remember exactly what the big difference was there, why they had to change it. It was like Americans didn't know what a philosopher was or some shit like that. Or they just wanted like Sorcerer's Stone, kind of like a series of unfortunate events where it was always like the Grim Grotto or the Reptile Room or like whatever. Onomatopoeia, I guess. Anyway, I thought it was an excellent start. I really, really liked the book. I loved it when I read it back then. I liked it when I read it, just recently. And again, I just finished listening to Deathly Hallows, so it's now a little bit of a distant memory, I will admit, and it's relatively short, so you kind of get through it. But that's the thing about the books, is that they do kind of age with the reader. Rowling was like really aware or just understood that, she was going to have this kind of like group of people growing up reading this novel. And as the story progressed, it kind of matured a little bit. And yes, it sure did. Like, definitely by the end, it was like a young adult book, I don't think there was any actually like full on swear words, but anyway, But when I was reading for the first time, I was like, okay, cool. Sorcerer's Stone, super great. Got through it. And then as soon as I went to read Chamber of Secrets, I couldn't get past the flying car for some reason. I remember this clearly. I can't necessarily back up my reasoning now. I don't know why. Maybe if you asked me back then. But it was like something about it was like juvenile. Again, obviously it's magic. There's fantasy. I'm not always like the biggest fantasy guy. So maybe there's something there where I already kind of had my guard up. And as soon as they gave me some bullshit, I was like, ah, fuck it. I'm out. But again, I thought like from all the magic that we saw in the first novel, flying car is like the easiest thing you could do. Like everyone's flying around on brooms. We already saw that in the first thing. What are we doing with cars? Super interesting. The fact that they like got like that they were seen by muggles, I thought was like hella careless. And I was like, this is stupid. So, and I went on to read Series of Unfortunate Events. Again, who knows? Maybe there's a bunch of other reasons. I enjoyed the grounded nature of Series of Unfortunate Events. I guess it was a little bit more rooted in reality, even though it was still like had a surrealist touch to it, absurdist in nature, in elements. But yet also straightforward and somewhat educational. So I really liked the Lemony Snicket Series of Unfortunate Events. Always stand by that. That was my Harry Potter as a kid. That's what I grew up with and waited for the next books to come out. And they also kind of matured a little bit with the reader as it went on, got a little bit more, the books got longer. Harry Potter, it's like the books were getting bloated, man. Like it was like, they were getting really big. So, and obviously noticing that, listening to them too, because it takes longer and longer to get through them. Obviously. But again, the problem is that we start to run into, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more today, knowing a lot more about the books, is that like, obviously the movies can only handle so much, right? Like, I'm not necessarily here to defend the Harry Potter movies. I'm not necessarily here to defend the Harry Potter books more than the other, but again, a lot of people get really up in arms about a lot of the mistakes in the movies, and there are things that I completely understand why people get rattled and get get their robes in a twist, so to speak. So the thing is that anytime you're adapting a novel, and I'm going to say this right now, get this out of the way, including spoiler alerts, I guess, if anyone's listened this far and you haven't read Harry Potter. The hardest thing about adapting a novel, especially like fantasy or sci-fi or anything where there's like completely made up imagery and gadgetry and whatever happenings, so to speak, events, it's relatively impossible to have every bit of that from the novel brought to the screen, because again, with a novel, with literature, you can bend space and time. You can draw it out. You can make a second last few pages. You can cross over 1,000 years in a couple sentences. You can age a character. You can shift between different realms. You can shift between different characters. You can go inside their mind. You can go, like, there's ultimate freedom, because you're essentially just like guiding someone's imagination, whatever they can imagine in their head. You're just kind of facilitating that. Whereas a filmmaker has to be able to put that up on a screen, and then you just like look at that and go like, and this is probably going to launch into a whole other thing on like, why are we even adapting all these novels? Like, yes, I guess it's cool, and it allows people to have more access to it. And yes, of course, maybe, maybe I'm the perfect example, is that I'm pursuing reading the books because I saw the movie. So it helps only promote the books, really, when you're adapting a book to a movie. But throughout time, there's been so many adaptations, and again, it's so hard to nail it. Even Lord of the Rings, there were so many places where Peter Jackson just couldn't do it on screen, even in the extended films, right? Like, there's just not enough time. And you can't, like, it's a different medium. Like, yes, it makes sense to adapt a movie to be like, or adapt a book to be like, oh my God, we can see this on screen. But again, you're completely missing, you're altering the medium itself. You're changing, how the art form was like meant to be taken in, right? I talk about this a lot in the audiobook podcast, but a lot of authors wrote a book because they knew the only way you're going to read that is by literally reading it in your hand, unless someone is like dictating it to you. Before audiobooks were mass produced and easily accessible, the only way you're going to read that information from that book is by having that book in your hand and reading the words off the page. And that's the art form itself. And some authors that are truly artists in their craft are able to push the boundaries of that limit and know and understand exactly how their audience is taking that book in. Audiobooks changes things a little bit because now someone's reading that and blah, blah, blah. But again, movies are the same thing, right? Like, it's, you're constantly, I've made this connection before. You're kind of constantly stepping back from literature, right? Like, if literature and reading a book, everything's happening in your head, right? Like, yeah, you're reading someone else's words, but all the imagery and everything, all the events are happening in your head. And then from there, you take a play, and that's like happening in the real world. You're in the same room as the happenings, but obviously there's a big suspension of disbelief because you have to be like, all right, this isn't really happening, but this is like a play at least. And the visceral, like, artistic connection, I think, is a lot stronger with that fact that you have to still have such amazing suspension of disbelief, because that exists when you're reading a book too, right? Like, you're like, you've completely suspended disbelief because you've now entered this realm of complete thought and imagination, and you're just reading that book, and whatever the words are coming to you, you're in that flow state of you've given yourself into the story. And again, now when you're watching a play, there is one more degree of separation there, where, yeah, you are seeing someone now do it. You don't really have to necessarily imagine it. You're seeing it, but you do have to imagine, if they're driving a car, like, obviously they're not driving a car on fucking stage, or, if it's a Peter Pan production, he's obviously not actually flying. You have to kind of ignore the fucking rope that you can obviously see, the cable. But again, that still, that bit of imagination that you still have to use to be like, okay, this is really this is the events that are being portrayed here are really happening. It creates a little bit more of that connection, and it's a little bit more of that kind of artistic connection there. And then again, you take another step further out of a play, and that's a movie, where again, now you've created a realm as the filmmaker. You've created a palette, an art form, a canvas that you're working off of, that you have to make sure everything is kind of like, depending on the type of film, spoon-fed to your artist, and I guess depending on the director too, but there's exposition, as they call it, where you have to have scenes to kind of like explain what's happening, and you kind of can't, there's the idea of Chekhov's gun, you can't, which comes from theater, but you can't, have anything in that film that isn't going to be used later. And again, you have a much more restricted time period, right? With a book, it can be as long or short as you want. But with a movie, it can't really be like 8 hours long, 6 hours long. Really, even over 3 hours is kind of absurd. Up until now, movies weren't really much longer than like 2 hours. So, you're very much restricted to that. TV, you're restricted even more. But obviously, again, it's still on film, and you kind of have to make sure like all the bases are covered. And especially nowadays with like visual effects and things like that, it's getting harder and harder to pull off like, oh, okay, I truly believe this, right? So again, yes, it's still art. I'm not saying in any way it's less art because of that suspension of disbelief idea. But again, I just mean like the connection you feel with it can kind of become a little bit lessened, I find, the further away you step from a film adaptation of a novel anyway. Any film's going to make you feel the way it's going to make you feel. But again, when you're adapting a novel to film, you have to make sure you're explaining everything. And again, just not enough time sometimes in especially the way Harry Potter went, and the books just got fatter and fatter. That's why they had to make Deathly Hallows 2 parts, is because they tried their best to fit everything in, and they still didn't cover everything. And there's filmmakers' choices and things like that. And again, I don't want to go too much into only the differences between the films and the books, but I kind of can't help but say it, because sometimes you're like, why? How could they not have added that in? So again, Philosopher's Stone, Sorcerer's Stone, however you want to call it. Really, really excellent start. I thought it was always funny, again, that Daniel Radcliffe's eyes weren't green. But again, the same thing goes for Hermione, Hermione, however you want to say it. Again, that was always funny. Like, everyone would, once we saw the first movie, where everyone's like, oh, that's how you say her name. I think Hermione, I think it was the way I used to say it when I first read it. I can't remember. Anyway, but again, you can't always be perfect with the way the actors look. So again, I don't want to harp on the differences there, but they fucking talk about it constantly in Harry Potter, about the eyes, Lily's eyes, and they're green and all this shit, right? Like, even like the connection to like Slytherin potentially is maybe touched upon there. Again, it's like, maybe like Daniel Radcliffe apparently was allergic to the contacts, so he couldn't wear them, but maybe we could have figured something out there, guys, anyway. And then Aunt Petunia and Dudley are blonde in the books, and they weren't in the movies. I thought that was just an interesting choice there, but again, just like really excellent start, really good way to kind of like establish his character, establish somewhat of his personality and like what he's capable of. And he kind of has this, like, Harry has this like hidden, power, and everyone knows who he is, but he doesn't really know who he is. And you can see as that goes on through the series, it's really interesting. He doesn't understand it. He's like, oh, everyone knows who I am. I don't know what that's supposed to be. Then he was like, everyone knows who I am. Yeah, fuck yeah, I'm Harry Potter. Like, that's what's up. And then it's kind of like, everyone knows who I am. And it's like, fuck, everyone knows who I am. Like, this is bullshit. Everyone thinks they know who I am, but they fucking don't, right? So it's super interesting. I think, again, speaks to a lot of teenagers' angst. Anyway, yeah, Professor Quirrell, good villain in that, I guess. Setting up Snape and how everything. Again, it's just a big setup book. It's a great book, Philosopher's Stone. Chamber of Secrets, also really good, relatively spooky. The name of the heir of Slytherin written in blood. All the snake talk, people getting petrified. Like I said, relatively spooky. Again, on the second round of actually listening to or reading the book all the way through, I liked it a lot more than when I first read it. An interesting story, but again, kind of really alluding more to this kind of hidden aspect of Harry and touching upon, there's some kind of connection between him and Voldemort. And it's interesting, there's that whole Dark Lord bit. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but like, it finally makes sense, like, why they don't say Voldemort, because it like breaks incantations. But do you think someone would have fucking figured that out? Been like, yo, Harry, I know you fucking think you're tough and you're going to say Voldemort all the time because you don't give a fuck, you ain't scared. But it like breaks incantations, you idiot. Anyway, we'll talk about that probably more in the Deathly Hallows one. I think that's where that comes up more. But again, it's interesting. Even between the first and second book, you can kind of see how the story itself is starting to mature a little bit more. You're starting to see the characters kind of become a little bit more well-rounded. That's another thing too I find with movies and literature in general, but especially with Harry Potter, is that Harry Potter, he had a lot of dark sides to him, and I think Rowling wanted to touch on that a lot because of that connection with Voldemort, and just like also that like shadow, understanding that, it makes character so much more well-rounded when maybe there's things that they do that you don't really jive with. You're like, I don't know if I would have done it that way. But again, you can't do that in a movie. You don't have enough time to have a character, have a fall, and a reconciliation all in the same movie, right? Like, I know it's a series, but again, each movie is self-contained in general. Prisoner of Azkaban, I thought was really good. In fact, that's kind of my favorite overall storyline. I almost hesitate to say that just because the preceding, the following books are all excellent. Chamber is a great story too, but there's just something about like this, like the contained story of Prisoner of Azkaban that I like with, Remus and, the whole story of all the friends. And it's super interesting. Again, the whole Marauders map, even kind of surprising that they don't mention that, Padfoot, whatever, the whole, what are the Marauders map? Sorry to all my potheads out there, my Potter friends. The Marauders map is Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prong. So Moony was Remus Lupin. Obviously Moony for werewolves. Again, we're kind of getting ahead of here. Wormtail, Peter Pettigrew, Padfoot, Sirius Black, and Prongs was James Potter. So again, super interesting that they didn't mention that for the Marauders map, even though it was so much used in the book, in the movie. But again, my favorite overall storyline, I think, it all came together really interestingly. I'll keep mentioning this as we go along. I can't help it from here on out, because again, a lot of these other like later books are kind of like there's this underlying twist that's kind of like lying in wait to the end. And, obviously watching the movies before, kind of spoils some of that, so to speak. So Prisoner of Azkaban, I think, had a little bit of that, with Remus being a werewolf and everything. But I thought it was really cool, again, how his friends were trying to help him out. And that was the whole idea behind the Whomping Willow, and they used to escape down there. And it revealed a little bit more about kind of the Snape and Potter, James Potter at least, relationship there, why he kind of hated James so much. So again, really good, like kind of third installment in the series, pushing things forward, keeping the story going. Goblet of Fire, huge book, a lot of people's favorites. Intense action, obviously the Triwizard Tournament, basically every step of the way. It was cool introducing, the new wizarding schools with Bo Batten, and where the fuck is Victor Crumb from? He's from... All my Harry Potter fans out there are probably screaming at me. Oh my God, I'm just thinking of Dormering or whatever the like other jail. Victor Crumb went to Durmstrang. Super interesting there. I thought Karkarov's character was kind of underplayed in the movie, but in the book, really, really interesting character. He was pretty fucking conniving. And, there's like all this gambling shit going on in the back. It's kind of funny in the books at moments, they kind of show their age sometimes. This is probably a little bit more in Prisoner of Azkaban, but I remember there's like a scene about like someone's watching their weight or something like that. Anyway, it was very like late 90s kind of like Atkins bullshit. But again, it's actually funny, Goblet of Fire really touches upon it, but overall, honestly, it's funny. There's times where I'm like, if I could sum it up in one word, Harry Potter is a great story about a kid who loves Quidditch. And that kind of, sums it up for me because, there's moments where it's brilliant, as an athlete, I actually love it. I think it's beautiful. I think it's actually really, really brilliant in the sense that, there's a moment in Deathly Hallows where Harry's like busting down, like somewhere down, down some hallway, ripping down to go fight some shit, fight some Death Eaters or whatever. And it's literally like one small little line that JK puts in there, but she goes, or she writes, he was like, going down the hallway with his Quidditch team, like behind him kind of thing. And I was just like, fuck yeah. Like Wood was back, like all these dudes, like from back in the day. And in fact, like Ginny was like a big part of the Quidditch and shit, right? Like they kind of touch on it a little bit in the movies, but man, she got fucking gypped. But again, I don't know if JK was an athlete herself, but there's something about the way she writes about Quidditch and in that sense, just sport, that is very much like she knows what she's talking about. There's that love there, the whole bits about like Harry kind of like doing whatever he can to kind of make the Quidditch work. Make the Quidditch team work when he becomes captain and things like that, like the struggles on the team and the politics and friends and Ginny's on the team. He ends up like, I think he gets suspended. No, that's in Order of the Phoenix with Umbridge. I think that's when he gets suspended. But again, just like fucking awesome perspective of sport and in school too, right? Like even McGonagall being a teacher who used to be a Quidditch player, she was always like, fuck yeah, like go for it. Like, yeah, you can like miss a little bit of school for your sport kind of thing and like represent the school and represent your house. Super, again, really, really cool. I really appreciated that. But again, super cool story with the whole Triwizard Tournament and how Harry got put in there. Mad-Eye Mooney, that whole fucking bit. Obviously, Cedric's death is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking in the movies, but it's even more heartbreaking in the novel. Another bit that they don't really talk about much in the movies is Percy's relationship with the Weasleys. One of Ron's brothers, Percy Weasley, he's a fucking bastard and is like just towing the company line for the Ministry of Magic and is like neglecting his family. And the Weasleys are interesting. They kind of like, I feel like Rowling uses the Weasleys as like this analog of just like anything that can kind of happen in a family because Harry doesn't really have one. The way, she would just like use the Weasleys as like a backdrop, weddings, deaths, births, all this shit like is all happening kind of with the Weasleys, money, financial issues, work issues, like all this shit. And it's great. It's just like an interesting kind of vehicle. I find the way that she uses the Weasleys. Order of the Phoenix, super excellent. Again, like I mentioned, it's kind of hard knowing the punchline sometimes. Just I've seen the movies before and just had a little bit of the I keep saying a little bit of the magic. I got to stop saying that's too punny, but you lose some of the oomph when you kind of know what's going to happen. But I will say Umbridge is definitely one of the most hated characters that I've ever come across in any literature or movies. She is just absolutely awful. But also the epitome again of, it's funny that I mentioned Percy. She is kind of just like the ultimate, company person who's just going to do whatever it takes to keep her job. I don't know. Keep the ministry happy in her specific case. So whatever that means. The occlumency lessons were really interesting with Snape and Harry and like what Harry could see into Snape's mind. It was always funny. Snape was kind of like busting Harry's mind open, but he does it once back to him and sees like one little memory of Snape getting hung upside down and fucking toyed around with. And all of a sudden, you're done and Snape is a fucking dick. And I always wondered about that because like he kind of like went against Dumbledore's wishes. So And that kind of like did kind of come back to haunt Harry a little bit, that he didn't get those occlumency lessons. So that was just a really, really interesting thing, I thought. Ron and Hermione are prefects in the Order of the Phoenix book, which I thought was really interesting in the sense that it kind of gives a really interesting look at a dynamic with friends when one of your friends kind of becomes like a bit of an authoritarian figure. Let alone, like, it kind of made perfect sense for Hermione to be one. But then when Ron was there, where he's kind of like a little bit of a badass, you could see where he was getting a little corrupted here and there. And like, he could just kind of, so the richness of the stories really did progress kind of as things went. And, Spew, Hermione's kind of like entire MO about kind of helping house elves was an interesting part of the book. Cho Chang, I thought, was used as a red herring. Again, knowing the punchlines and knowing what happens in the movies, I thought Cho Chang and the kind of, but it does make it a little bit real. It makes it a little bit more real in the sense that, wasn't Harry just like pursuing Ginny from the get-go? But again, just like it's a big throw off, especially when you don't know where the story goes. So take what you will from there. And I always thought it was funny with Trelawney's prediction that she predicted Harry, or like the happenings of a child being able to like take over the Dark Lord and all that stuff, that it could have actually been Neville. Like the prophecy actually applied to both Harry or Neville. So super interesting there. And again, Neville was obviously such a major part of them winning the Battle of Hogwarts and eventually defeating the Dark Lord. Half-Blood was cool. Again, I think Ginny and Harry's relationship was developed so much more in Half-Blood Prince, which was to me the crux of that. I think really interesting, how Snape did that whole thing, and you learn, it was an interesting way to learn a little bit more about a character that's pretty hated. Again, I remember really hating Snape in reading the first novels for the first time, but again, knowing what he does and knowing the backstory, finally when you're reading these instances for the first time, it just doesn't hit quite as hard. But still, if you were reading for the first time, I could only imagine. Ginny is, kind of fucked over in the movies. Her personality is so much better in the book. She's cool. She's badass. She's headstrong. She tells Harry to fuck off a couple times, figure it out. But again, I think Half-Blood was really, really good. It was definitely hitting, its stride. And I could only imagine, that was like, I remember, I think when Half-Blood was out, was like kind of peak Harry Potter, like, really pushing it. I think obviously when Deathly Hallows came out was obviously the peak, because that was like the end probably, but just like fever, I'm talking people lining up, freaking out for it. And then like Dumbledore, going spoiler alert, if you got this far already, Dumbledore dying or whatever, such a huge moment. And I think really well done in the books, where Harry was under the invisibility cloak and binded by Dumbledore, and he wasn't able to move. He wasn't just like kind of hiding like he was in the movies. Just super, super well done. The whole like wand lore was really interesting. Who owns a wand, who doesn't, and how that passes between people. I thought that was really, really well done. Again, there's even so much, like I feel like I could do 5 episodes on this stuff, but I can't. There's just too much. Deathly Hallows, again, to just kind of wrap it up here. It's just so good. Like realistically, it's hard for me to portray how much I really did enjoy these, and I do believe that they're truly meant. Will go down as, great literature. Say what you will about JK, but it is really, really well done. It's archetypal. It has originality. It doesn't seem completely ripped off from other stories. The universe is relatively, well-rounded. And again, like, I'm just not the biggest fantasy guy, so this was just really well done. And again, just really well written book in general. Like, I think my favorite chapter of the entire series was the Dursleys' departure in Deathly Hallows. It was when the Dursleys and Harry in the book. It's when the Dursleys leave Harry for the last time. Who knows if they'll ever see each other again? But just really nice and beautiful and heartfelt. And Dudley, shakes Harry's hand, and there's some type of reconciliation there that is just super special. But again, interesting story. Especially with Harry not really knowing how to kill all the Horcruxes and taking Ron and Hermione with them, and Ron leaving and all that stuff. There's so much drama and there's so much turmoil there. But again, a lot of the book is really spent like out trying to figure out how to kill these Horcruxes, and they're really kind of like banging their head against the wall a lot. And that's like, what, do we have to spend that much time? Is Dumbledore a bastard, right? Like, did he just raise Harry, like a lamb to the slaughter kind of thing? It's hard to say, right? Like, obviously he sacrificed himself to get Harry to be the one who can control the Elder Wand, things like that. There was a lot of skullduggery, but then there was a lot of selfishness too. Like, the whole Grindelwald thing, and I get why they went off and did the whole Fantastic Beast things with Grindelwald, but again, it's just like such a deep other part of the story where, and with Dumbledore being like, it was the mistakes of an old man and all these things. It's really hard. It's really hard to know. Because generally speaking, he's great. I think everyone loves Dumbledore, right? Like, just the way he is, but just it's questionable. It's questionable, really. I think in some ways, it's the perfect ending. I think they did a really good job having Harry being one of the Horcruxes, technically. The power of love and that whole idea is just really special. And I think that's super cool. And again, it was always something where Voldemort was like, oh, fuck love and all this shit. And it's like, he just never had it. He never had anybody, never had any friends, or like true friends, never had any family. And it drove himself to split his soul, right? I think it was interesting, again, having the invisibility cloak actually even be one of the Deathly Hallows. I thought was really interesting. It's kind of overused, if I may say so, in the series. Like, he's constantly using this fucking cloak, and it's like, yeah, it's sick. Like, it's the ultimate power to have invisibility, but it also being death is just like too much, like fucking constantly with this fucking cloak. But again, back to Voldemort. Like, again, he's such a complex villain, because there was really at no point did JK kind of, hold back like that. He used to be a person, and he was completely diluted and completely poisoned by dark magic and the dark arts. But there's something that's always like pitiful about him, and like Harry takes pity on him, and feels sorry for him, and does all this stuff where it's like, he just seems like so desperate and stuff like that, which is why, maybe is brilliant from JK's perspective, because she is like setting us up to be like, he's capable of anything, right? Like, he's such a desperate man, and he split his soul into all these pieces. He doesn't give a fuck about shit. But again, in general, really, really well done. I applaud JK for everything she did. Mrs. Rowling, Ms. Rowling. It's just one of those cultural things that will always go down in history, because it just touches those archetypal, those old John Campbell kind of, hero's journey type things, where you're leaving the comfort zone, you're going through all these trials and tribulations, and you kind of return back to the beginning, And then, Harry has his sons, and they go to, and their daughter too, with Ginny, and they go off to school, and they have that, it's this wonderful little bow that Rowling puts over on the end of it too. I don't know how everyone feels about that little like epilogue chapter, but I think it's beautiful. And there's some beautiful moments in that book. Really well done. Really good literature. Again, will be studied. Some people I know might be doing their whole fucking academic career based around it. So again, I want to hear what you guys think. I want to hear if you guys read it. Did you read it when you were a kid? Are you reading it now? Is it weird reading it as an adult? I don't know. I don't think so. Anyway, super interesting. Let me know what you guys think. Hit us up. Just a chat. Twitter, Instagram, Bigmark Podcast, YouTube, Patreons. Love y'all. Expelliarmus. Peace.